Welcome back to Behavioral Science for Brands, a podcast where we bridge the gap between academics and practical marketing. Every week, Richard and I sit down and go deep behind some of America's most successful brands. I'm Michael Aaron Flicker.
And I'm Richard Shotton.
And today we're sitting with Steve Martin, an internationally recognized expert in influence and persuasion and CEO of Influence at Work UK. Let's get into it. So Steve, welcome to Behavioral Science for Brands. Richard and I, as we were talking about before the show started, are on a little hunt, a little mission to bring behavioral science to the world of American marketers. And we're thrilled to have you on the show today. But before we get into our conversation, if you'll indulge me, let me give the listeners a little bit of background on you. So don't blush while I do this. But you are a leading authority on the fields of influence and persuasion. You're co-author of a New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestseller, Yes, 50 Secrets from the Science of Persuasion, which has sold over 1.5 million copies. And your most recent book, Messengers, Who We Listen To, Who We Don't, and Why, delves into the factors that make certain individuals more persuasive than others. And beyond your writing, you're a faculty director at the Behavioral Science at Columbia Business School and a guest lecturer at Harvard London School of Economics. You're also the chair of the Global Association of Applied Behavioral Scientists. And for those of our listeners who may have not gotten a chance to look at your books yet, you are a regular contributor at the New York Times, BBC, and Harvard Business Review, and you also have a little column we were talking about that I'd love to share more with our listeners during today's conversation. Thanks for being with us today. Our listeners love stories, so maybe we could start with, well, how did you get introduced to the world of influence, to the world of persuasion? Maybe you could just share with us how that all started.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed for the very kind invitation to join you on your podcast. It's a movement that I support. Consider me a fully paid up member now. My story is steeped in good fortune and good timing. I started out working in the corporate world. I worked for a big healthcare company. And I was in one of those roles where, you change roles every 12, 18 months. And I rapidly found myself in a position that I had really little experience or capability for. And one of the roles that I was responsible for was our sales and marketing effectiveness. And it struck me that we didn't really have any good playbook for how to do that well. But, I studied psychology. I read about Robert Cialdini's work. And on a whim, I contacted him and said, hey, look, we've got this program of work. I think you have some interesting insights that you could contribute to us. Do you consult? Do you provide advice to commercial organizations? And I ended up speaking to one of his postdocs, and the conversation over email went on for a couple of weeks. And then a few weeks later, I ended up speaking to the man himself. We thought that we could do some work together. And then the company I was working for was acquired by another company. And I don't know if you've ever been in that sort of situation before, but every project, every program stops.
Yes.
And there we are thinking, well, we maybe had a good project going there, and then nothing's going to happen now for 6 to 12 months. And Cialdini said, well, look, you seem to have an aptitude for this ability to take insights from academia, peer-reviewed research, field studies, randomized controlled experiments, and look for the gold, connect the dots to the real world where it could be applied. Maybe we could do something broader together. And that was in 2000, so it's 25 years ago. It was a very lucky moment for me. I ended up going over to the US. I trained with Bob. We worked together. We've become very dear friends, pretty much family now, I guess, in a way. And 25 years on, we're still working together. We write together. He's long retired now, but I've had the good fortune to kind of pick up the baton, if you like, and keep moving things on where Bob took the influence research. So that's the story.
It's a lovely story. And for some of our younger listeners, maybe something to pluck from what you've shared is there's never a reason to not reach out, to put yourself out there and to make a chance, because you never know if you're reaching someone at the other end of the line at a moment where there could be a connection, where there could be an opportunity. I don't know if you've reflected on that in the last 25 years, but for those listening, it's only luck, in that it was a chance that the connection occurred. Everything else is your own good doing, isn't that right?
Well, I have two stories to add to that. The first is, this is going to make me sound like a real humble bragger, kind of name dropper, but it's just the case. A few years ago, I was fortunate enough to spend the day with Danny Kahneman, and we were walking along the South Bank in London. It was the launch of the paperback of Thinking Fast and Slow, and we were chatting away, and he was talking about success. And I said, well, what's the definition of success? And he said, well, success is a combination of two things, talent and good luck. And I said, well, that makes sense. I've had my fair share of good luck. I said, but what about supreme success? What about those people that are just like, not just successful, they are uber successful? And he turned around and he looked at me and he went, they have more luck. And your point, I think, about asking and not being, scared about just picking up the phone to people. Actually, there's evidence for this. A good friend of mine, Vanessa Bonds at Cornell, she wrote the book, You Have More Influence Than You Think. Primarily most of her research has been concerned with the fact that most of us underestimate the likelihood that if we do ask someone for something, they'll actually help us. We typically underestimate our ability by about half. I think Vanessa's advice is extraordinarily sensible and highly applicable. She basically says, look, I find it super helpful to go into situations with the mindset that they're going to say yes to me. And two things happen. Oftentimes they do say yes to me, and I find myself in less arguments.
Does she speculate as to why people underestimate?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons. So the first is that we think about asking for help differently if we are the requester compared to if we are the person that's being asked. So when we think about, well, I'm going to ask Michael to help me out here, maybe my mind goes to the thing that might be the barrier to Michael helping. Michael's a busy guy. He's got lots of other things going on. He probably doesn't have the time. I don't want to kind of disturb him. So I'm going to underestimate the likelihood he's actually going to say yes, because I'm paying attention to all the kind of largely economic costs that Michael is likely to incur if he says yes to me. Of course, if someone asks you to do something, you're not necessarily paying attention to the economic aspects of that request. You're probably more minded to be thinking about the social costs if you say no. Am I likely to come across as, someone that's unhelpful? Am I likely to be seen as someone that's distant, disconnected if I say no? And so you get this bizarre situation where the people that are doing the asking are underestimating the likelihood. Yes. The requestee is more likely to say yes. And so you get this situation where networking events don't happen. Those opportunities in business where a meaningful exchange could lead to something happen less often. So I think Vanessa's right on the money. Go into situations with that mindset of someone is probably going to say yes to you. You might get yes more often, but you'll certainly be less argumentative. You'll be in situations where there's less conflict between you, because if you're going to go into a situation thinking that someone is going to say no to you, it's almost like you're preparing the argument to overcome the objections, to kind of get over those barriers. And that seems to be disconnecting from a relationship perspective.
What's lovely about this opening conversation is it's so much like all of our podcasts, which we look at a situation and we look at the academics behind it to uncover more of the human truth that exists. And Steve, you've naturally done that. What we want for everyone to maybe take away from this, in addition to Vanessa's recommendation that you should go, that you went through, is you can never know what the other side that you're requesting, how they've prioritized their thinking into their response. So being more open to asking and being more encouraged to go in and do it, it can only lead to better outcomes.
I'm minded to agree with that.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And so as we think about all the work that you've done, Steve, Richard and I were particularly drawn to your book Messengers because it has so much applicability to brand marketers and to those of us who are interested in growing healthy companies, growing healthy brands. And when Richard and I were preparing for today's episode, we were talking about something you've said quite often, that the messenger is the message. Maybe you could just take a step back, tell us what you mean by that, and maybe tell us a little bit about the book overall and your thoughts on it.
Well, sure. We have to start with Cialdini again, Robert Cialdini, who wrote the Bible on social influence, and specifically what you put into a message that is likely to influence the recipient to say yes to it, to lean into it, to trust it, to accept it. And there's no way I'm going to write a book that trumps that. But one of the things that Joe Marks, who was one of our PhD students at the time, was working for me at Influence at Work, and I would often find ourselves discussing over lunches and beers and things like this, was a shift in society. This was around 2016, 2017. And we started to notice how oftentimes it wasn't what was being said that seemed to carry sway, that seemed to connect with others. There seemed to be something about who was saying it. And what was really interesting was the number of examples that we could immediately come up with that demonstrated this perspective. And we've all experienced it, by the way. You know, every one of your listeners, I'm sure, will have had that situation, that experience where they've got into a room, they had an idea, a proposition, a presentation to make, and it's landed on deaf ears. And that in itself can be frustrating. But frustration will quickly turn to annoyance when a couple of days later, someone else comes along with pretty much the same idea that you had. And when they present it, it's almost miraculously everyone says this is the best idea ever. And if you think about that, that makes no sense when you think about the content and the conduct of the message, because it's the same. It must be something about who is saying it. And when you start to pay attention to things, oftentimes what happens is it's all you see. You know, you look around you and you see everything. And, you know, we start to see examples of how is it our politicians can lie, yet they're still listened to and people take them credibly? How is it that this idea managed to kind of get hundreds of millions of pounds or dollars in investment, and the idea sucks, and other good ideas get largely ignored? And so Joe and I started to explore this idea that there must be something here in the psychology of influence and persuasion where it's not necessarily the features or the truth or wisdom of what is being said that causes it to be successful. It's something about the messenger that sent that message and the characteristics of those individuals that seem to have a big impact. And so, you know, we coin this term. Increasingly now we're living in a society where the messenger has become the message, and we are paying less attention. We are scrutinizing less the relative truths and wisdoms of what is being presented to us. And we're simply using the messenger status or connectedness as our decision trigger, as our, well, if Richard Shotton says it's true, then it absolutely has to be true. And that's helpful. It's easy. It makes decision-making more efficient and effective. And of course, in the context of society, our politics and trust, it's absolutely disastrous.
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, it's hard to hear you speak of this and not immediately go to, as an American, the political climate in early 2025, regardless of the side of the spectrum that you're on. This is almost apolitical in terms of the party that you're in, but just the moment that we all seem to be in society. I have a personal passion for politics. Steve Richard knows this very deeply. But we'll keep on message, and maybe we could do a separate episode about the impact of this thinking on politics. You've talked about how there's 8 characteristics that we should look at, but they fall into 2 main buckets of hard, soft. Maybe you could talk about the split of these characteristics and how do we look through those hard and soft characteristics in understanding this.
Sure. Yeah. So you're exactly right. We largely categorize messengers and the likelihood that they are going to be heard, regardless of the truth or wisdom of what they are presenting, in one of 2 ways. Hard messengers are essentially characterized by the fact that they are perceived by their audience to have some status over that audience. They are rich and famous, so they have socioeconomic power, or they're seen as competent. They have instrumental value. They have an instructive ability that their audience do not have. They could be dominant. So we know from the literature that there are certain characters in life that are just dispositionally dominant. Their modus operandus, if you like, in the world is to win. To the victor goes the spoils, and to hell with everyone else. And so they take this predominantly dominant position. And in other instances, we're influenced by the messenger that we just see as attractive to us, typically physically attractive to us. And so those 4 characteristics of socioeconomic position, dominance, competence, and physical attractiveness all signal some status that speaker, that messenger has over the audience. And that might incline that audience to be more willing to accept and listen to what they have to say. Now, that sounds hard. That sounds autocratic. That's not full picture, of course, because those aren't the only messengers that we listen to. We also listen to messengers that are characterized by what we term as soft traits. The definition of a soft trait is a messenger who is able to demonstrate they have not status over their audience, but a connectedness with their audience. And these are typically signaled in one of 4 ways. They're seen to be warm. They are seen as vulnerable. They are seen to be trustworthy, or they are seen to be charismatic. So those are the kind of 2 broad categories of messengers, and then the 4 hard and 4 soft traits. Of course, it's also important to point out here that it's unlikely that it's any one single messenger trait that will essentially carry sway over all audiences. We'll often kind of pivot between those different approaches of hard and soft, and certain contexts are going to demand our likelihood to listen more to a status-driven messenger over a connected one. But in terms of the research and the work that Joe and I have actually done, we can largely account for the overwhelming majority of messengers who are heard in society will be drawing on one or more of those fundamental principles and traits.
Yeah. And I think it's that split into the 8 characteristics that makes Messenger such a useful book. Now, it's all very well and good to talk about the messenger effect and know that sometimes the messenger can be more important than the message. But it's then saying what characteristics lead to a persuasive messenger that makes it such a practical book. We're probably not going to have time to go through all 8 of those characteristics. And maybe, as you say, because the hard one's still a little bit autocratic, we could focus on some of the softer part. And one that I'm particularly interested in, because I think it's a challenge that both people have on a personal level, but also a commercial level, is your point about trustworthiness.
Yeah.
Brands and business always talk about, well, how can we be trusted? How can we be trustworthy? So could you elaborate on what makes for a trustworthy messenger?
Well, I'd be happy to talk about trust, but also maybe talk about some of the misconceptions of trust as well, because I'm calling in from central London. Oxford Circus is just down the road from me. I reckon if I went out of the office now and just randomly went up to 100 people in the street and asked them what trust meant to them, I'd likely get dozens of different definitions and answers. And so that's the starting point, I think, for studying trust, is that it means many things to different people. We have a clear definition of what we mean by trust. Trust is essentially, in our world, how confident someone feels about predicting the future behavior of someone else. And that can be a really helpful definition, because what it immediately signals is that trust has nothing to do with truth. You often find people say, well, I trust this person because they tell the truth, they're always straight with me, these kind of things. Well, those things might actually be true. But what is also true is we know, and we have got lots of data on this, both from the US and the UK and other democracies as well, is that our politicians can lie to us, clearly, objectively telling mistruths, and people's trust in them will often go up, not down. And so there's the first point about trust, is trust has nothing to do with truth. Trust is essentially a risk, a future bet that we take on someone else's future behavior. And if I feel confident that I can predict how you're going to behave in the future, Michael, I'm more likely to trust you. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I think is important to recognize is that we trust people, and we trust our brands, and we trust our institutions for different reasons. Sometimes we trust brands and companies and people because we see them as competent. They're like a safe pair of hands. We trust Amazon because we know that when we click that buy now button, that product is going to be there within 24 hours. They tell us it's going to be, and they deliver time and time again. So we trust them for their competence. But we often also trust people for their integrity or their benevolence. We're probably less likely to trust Amazon for their integrity and their benevolence. But it would be kind of important to trust your bank for their integrity, or trust, a brand for their benevolence. And so there are different ways in which we can demonstrate and we can measure trust. And there are different reasons why people will trust different brands, and they're not always the same. So it's complex.
I find that super useful, Steve. In the marketing trade press, trust is defined, I think, or people maybe never define it, but how they use it reflects a belief in it's all about integrity. It's all about morals and ethics. And I think realizing that's half of it, but the other half, or that, there's the integrity part, but the other half is competence. That's another way to build trust. That's a really useful, I think, split.
Well, I think it's a third of it, not even a half of it, because, not only we've got integrity, we've got benevolence as well. But here's the other challenge that we find, and this is why I've got a whole team working on this now, is how do you know if you're trusted? How do you know if people trust you? And there's the classic annual survey that comes out. And one of the things that I've noticed that brands and organizations, be they governments, big companies, brands do, is they look at where they are on that list, and they do one of two things, which largely results in them doing nothing at all. If, these are the top 10 banks and my bank is in the top 3, then happy days. I don't have to do anything. If I'm in the bottom 3, then maybe I might need to start thinking about doing this. And if I'm in the middle, then I'm probably safe because, I'm not the worst. So, but the problem with ratings like that is they're founded on a simple question, which is, do you trust this brand? Do you trust this person? Do you trust this organization? And because trust means so many different things to so many different people, I do have to question how reliable, a simple rating question is. And so there are behavioral measures now. And you two as behavioral scientists will, I guess, be kind of intrigued at this, that we can actually quantify trust, and we can measure it, and we can put specific metrics and numbers on a brand's perceived competence, integrity, and benevolence. And perhaps arguably even more importantly, also say whether the things that they are most trusted on actually matter the most to them. You may be seen as highly competent, but actually one of the things that we recognize is that, there's lots of companies in industries that are seen as highly competent. Banks are largely, in the main, seen as mostly competent. And so differentiations between competence in banks makes no meaningful difference at all. Doesn't matter how much they do to raise trust and competence, it's not going to have any impact in terms of a market share or whatever outcome or metric they're looking for. And so diving deeper into these features of trust and having reliable measures and metrics that not only tell you how trusted you are, but actually what specifically you need to do as a brand to maintain that trust or build it if you've lost it. That's where the research is now going. That's super exciting.
Yeah, I think you're right. the idea of being able to know how you can get someone to trust you rather than just trying to, flail around claiming that you're a trustworthy person. One of the bits I've loved that I've seen you discuss before is the stolen thunder effect. So this idea, if you admit that your argument isn't perfect, if you draw attention to a flaw or a drawback, that can boost the trustworthiness and the trust of other messages. Could you talk a bit about what you know of the stolen thunder effect and how people can use that?
Sure. And let's define it in a number of ways, because I think, it's described, I've heard it described in a multiplicity of different ways. But generally speaking, the universal truth is that no one has any proposition, point of view argument that is 100% perfect. And, every idea, every product, every proposition is going to have its downsides. And essentially one way in which messengers can increase their perceived trustworthiness, and interestingly, their perceived competence as a side effect of this as well, is to actually recognize that there are downsides to their proposition and actually present them first. The best known cases that we actually have come from law. We know, for example, that attorneys, lawyers who point out flaws, drawbacks, weaknesses in the proposition, the case they're about to make, do two things. Not only do they assign in that audience's mind greater credibility and trustworthiness to them as a communicator, but what they also do is they pull the rug from underneath the opposition who are about to attack them on those weaknesses in that instance. It acts in Xander van der Linden, the kind of fake news guy over at Cambridge, would describe this as an inoculation, in the same way as you're going to shot. You're introducing, an attenuated form of a virus to kind of protect you against being attacked. This happens in the same way. That's your stolen thunder or your double-sided argument approach there.
And you mentioned the example of that being used in court cases. Is that something you think could be used in commercial situations as well? Have you seen businesses employing this at scale?
Well, yes, but and actually you've cited numerous examples in your books as well, Richard. The ugly is only skin deep from Volkswagen, Avis, we're only number 2, so we try harder. L'Oreal, we're expensive, but you're worth it. Each of those examples in the world of branding essentially is constructed in the same format. You take a drawback, a weakness, something you're likely to be attacked on, and use it as a persuasive strength by presenting it first. Usually the transition is that word but, and we've all had performance reviews where your manager turns around and says, well, Michael, you did a pretty good job there, but you know what you're going to have to pay attention to next, right? So there's a linguistic structure to it as well. What's interesting, I wonder if in a world there we are so quick to judge whether or not there is any impact in a marketing perspective, a branding perspective, in terms of the relative potency of this approach, given that, we're not measuring our exposure to messages in absolute numbers anymore. We're actually measuring it in distance. It's literally meters scrolled on a screen now. We don't measure influence in terms of, 1,000 ads that you've seen in a day. We literally measure it in terms of meters. And so if all you see is the weakness and you don't get the opportunity to say, but, and then hear the upside, whether that kind of scarcity of attention might make the execution of a strategy slightly more problematic in a branding, in a court of law, in a debating society, in the House of Lords, or whatever the case may be. Absolutely, it still rings true. I do wonder about that. Maybe Richard and we should do some research.
I think that's a fascinating question, because I think you could take it the other way around and say, start from that same premise of there is a scarcity of attention, there's phenomenal clutter. Well, you could say we know that one of the surefire ways to grab people's attention is to behave distinctively, the von Restorff effect. So if every other competitor is bragging and saying they're amazing and not admitting those downsides that you mentioned, well, if you admit a flaw, you're distinctive, and that should increase noticeability. So you're right, there's a trade-off. It could increase the probability of being noticed, and that's a phenomenal step forward in the effectiveness of your messaging. But for that partial attention group, well, yeah, that's a very fair point that they only take in the weakness and not the strength. That's not so good.
Well, I've been doing this for 25 years. And one thing I can tell you, regardless of the relative effectiveness and on the balance of probability, I would always choose to do it rather than not do it. But that doesn't make it any less a hard sell.
And I would say for marketers who spend a lot of time saying, how do we stop you in the scroll? How do we pause your thumb in those meters and meters of scrolling? There's only so much there's only so many tactics that one can use. And if the von Restorff effect or an unexpected message stops you in the scroll, then it gives you that introduction to deliver the full message. So the challenge is, how do brands break through in the scroll, and what are the tactics that they can employ to do that? An unexpected admission of a flaw may be one of the ways to stop people in the scroll and get their attention to deliver the rest of your message.
Potentially, yeah. I think I maintain that it's probably still going to be a hard sell. Hey, Mr. Marketeer, or Mrs. Marketeer, or Miss Marketeer, whatever it is these days, that, all these millions of dollars spent promoting your brand, getting your tone of voice right, your positioning, this, that, and the other, and then the first thing we want you to do is admit a weakness about it. That's a pretty tough sell when people are scrolling. But I think there's a broader point, and that point about unexpectedness, and particularly surprise, is a good attention grabber. But here's the reason why it's a good attention grabber. And it's not for the reasons that people typically think. They go, oh, if I surprise people, I get them to pause. Well, that might be true and you grab their attention. But here's the interesting thing about unexpectedness and surprise. Our brain doesn't have a way out of surprise and unexpectedness. We don't have when I feel fear, this is what I do. When I'm happy, I act in this way. When I'm surprised, there's uncertainty. When I'm experiencing something that's unexpected, I have no emotional response. I have nothing in my data bank to tell me what I should do in the context of surprise. What surprise does is it opens the door and allows a brand, a marketeer, a message to then say, now you are surprised, this is or how you should think. And that is the real attribute of surprise and unexpectedness. Yes, it catches attention, but it doesn't complete the answer. Now you've got that attention, your brain, your emotional reaction to surprise, there are no answers to that. You have to be told what to do in that instance. That's where I see the opportunity.
So you're saying the surprise creates a degree of malleability in the audience, that there's an element of that people will be slightly more persuadable. Would that be the argument?
It sounds slightly manipulative. Their minds are open.
Yeah. That's a more positive spin. I like that. Yeah,
and their minds are open to being directed in a certain channel or a certain way.
And one of the things I've always loved about psychology and behavioral science is that there are many different ways to get a positive outcome. And it's up to communicators to pick which one they use. So we've talked about surprise as an upside. The other thing I found fascinating in messengers was your argument that one way to build trustworthiness was through simple contact. So familiarity as being another angle. Could you talk about how simple contact can build trustworthiness? What you meant by that?
Yeah. So the way I describe trust is a contact sport. Okay. It's hard to understand and to recognize without really doing a lot of research and homework and spending lots of time and resources. It's hard to kind of come to an objective decision about who is competent, who has integrity, who demonstrates benevolence, these kind of things. And so we do what we all do the same thing, right? We are faced now with a situation where we are asked increasingly difficult to answer questions. And the one thing that we all do when we're faced with a difficult to answer question is we answer an easier one that no one asked. Okay, that's the way we do it. So do I trust this person for their competence? Well, I don't know about that, but what I do know is this. I've spent quite a bit of time with them recently, and I've got a bit of contact with them. So there are what I call almost kind of enablers of trust. And the enablers, there's two of them, and they work regardless of the domain of trust that you are trying to elevate, whether it's competence, integrity, or benevolence. The first is frequency of contact. Okay, so hence my point that trust is a contact sport. Others in psychology might regard that as kind of mere exposure effects, just regularity, familiarity, these kind of things. So that's one. The other, though, which is really important for the maintenance of trust, is consistency of those effects. So let's go back to where we were a few moments ago talking about, why is it that people can lie and their trust actually goes up in some groups? We've got really good data on this. So we know, the US, for example, one well-known broadsheet in the US actually had a totalizer of lies that a president made over the course of his term. I think it was in the first term about 33,000. We're 8 weeks in and counting at the moment on the current one. But we have our own example of this in the United Kingdom. So it seems without doubt that Boris Johnson, when he prorogued Parliament in October 2019, lied to the Queen in order to kind of prorogue Parliament. And the surveys that we and others conducted afterwards, when we asked people, do you think he lied to the Queen? 90% of people said, yeah, absolutely he did. What was really interesting was the follow-up question, because we then asked, what has that done to your level of trust in the Prime Minister and the government? And for half of the people, it went up. And we're like, that head-scratching moment. We're saying, hang on a minute, you just told us that he lied, but now you're saying that your trust in him has gone up. And their answer was really instructive. They said, yes, he told my lie. He told my truth. And that, I think, is hugely illustrative of what's actually now happening and why trust, I'm increasingly convinced, is one of, if not the single most important thing to any institution, organization, or brand, which is we're in a society now where we're not being asked to decide anymore. We're being asked to choose a side. And we now have data in our trust research that's actually showing that some people are choosing to just reject trust completely. And just to say, everyone's lying to me. I have no faith in anyone. And in the latest research, so I'm calling in from our office in London. We have a partnership here with MHP Group that run the trust analytics and polarized tracker with us. We do this every 4 months. We run it. We now have, Michael and Richard, really compelling data that shows that close to 3 in 10 people in the UK characterize themselves as a super distruster. They actively seek ways to distrust brands, institutions, organizations. And what's really fascinating about this group is they defy every lazy stereotype. They're not men of 55 years of age that voted for Brexit, that live in rural or northern communities, that don't have degrees. They are more likely to be Zoomers than they are Boomers. They skew slightly more male versus female, but not too much. And they represent both sides of the political spectrum. They're just as likely to vote left as they are right. And what's really important about them and why they're so important to institutions and brands is they are loud, they have money, and they have a voice. And that's kind of super interesting to me, that trust is a fundamental, it's a messenger trait. It's what we look to determine how confident we feel in whether someone's going to come through with their service, their product, their delivery, their promise, whatever the case may be. And we have close to a third of the electorate that are characterizing themselves as super distrusters. And what's perhaps most relevant of all to brand leaders and marketeers is this is not a UK phenomenon. It's a Western phenomenon. So we're finding the same in the US, Holland, Germany, that's where we are. It's almost like we are in a society now where we're not dividing people on political affiliations. We have high trust people, we have low trust people. And if you're a brand that's trying to essentially present your product, your offering, your service to that kind of community, you need to build that into your thinking and understand, what are they going to trust about you? Is it about your competence or is it about something else? That is kind of fascinating.
Because there's two angles you could take as a business. You could say, well, let's employ some of these tactics that Steve mentions, like frequency of contact, admitting a flaw. Or you could say, advertising, communications are often a weak force. Let's ignore the super distrusters. If they're really cynical, one of the targeting metrics we should have is people who don't exhibit that characteristic, who are on the trusty end. Do you think either of those could be a fair approach? Is there one that you would, or other ones that you would add in?
I'm not sure is the honest answer. I can see some upsides to both, and I can see some downsides to them as well. Clearly the upsides of, well, let's employ some of these influence tactics to kind of see if we can mediate these challenges. The challenge with influence, of course, and the reason it's very different to persuasion, which is another thing that I think we often forget about, is that influence is about impact in the moment. It's about the effect that a marketeer, a message, an incentive, some external force can have on an individual or a group in a specific moment in time that causes them to change a decision, act, these kind of things, right? And so short term, that could well be a good option, Richard. But that's very different to persuasion. And persuasion is not an external change. Persuasion is all about inner changes that occur within people over time. It's that difference between kind of changing behaviors and changing minds. It's a lot easier to change behavior than it is to change people's minds. And in some instances, and for some markets, you don't really care about changing people's minds. Do you really care if the public love your product if they just use shitloads of it? You don't. But what you're talking about in that other arena is that, how do you change the whole marketplace such that people are persuaded? And in that instance, you may actually have to make a decision and say, look, there are certain people that we're just not going to be able to serve here. There are certain people that just don't fit our profile. And there's lots of tools and mosaics to be able to do that. And that might be an option as well. But I guess it's a super interesting question. I don't have an adequate or helpful answer to it.
Yeah. And it might well vary by product. Like if you're Coca-Cola, you can afford maybe just to ignore hard to persuade groups. If you are the government and you want to get people vaccinated, you don't have that liberty. You're going to have to try and persuade or influence that wrestling group.
Yeah. Or mandate.
Yeah, or mandate, absolutely.
And the problem with mandating is that there's already a third of the people in the country that are going to go, well, they're making us doing it now. And that's more evidence that I should not be trusting them. And I'll probably, recruit more into my movement as a result of doing that as well. So there are no easy outs. Yeah.
And Steve, something you did not touch on that it would be helpful to hear, this growth of super distrusters. Is it a growth over time that we're observing more and more are opting into this group, or has it always been 30% in the Western world are super distrusters? So the question is it growing over time? Is there any reason to believe it will slow down or stop growing, this amount of people that are super distrusters?
Yeah. So again, I do not have a definitive answer to that question, but here's what I can tell you that is definitive. All the time we've been measuring it, it's been growing. How much of it was in existence before we started measuring it, I have no idea. So whether it's been on that kind of even trajectory and there's been a trend over 15, 20, 30 years. But here's a couple of things that I think can be quite instructive. It's not evidence, it's anecdote. And I'm always cautious about anecdotes, but these in particular seem to be quite, I think, instructive to us. Let's take net zero as an example. So one of the things that we know from this group of super distrusters, these 3 in 10 currently, is that 5 or 6 years ago, they would have seen net zero and climate and the opportunity of the environment as an aspiration, as inspiring. Now they see it as an imposition. That, I think, is instructive, because what it's actually saying is that this is a group that is not only growing, it's a group that's changing. And here's a group that, some of them are democratically minded, they're young, they're smart, they have degrees, and they absolutely fall into that obvious stereotype of these are going to be supporters of the environment, of climate, they're going to mobilize behind all these different kind of things. The fact that they've actually switched now and they're seeing it as an imposition. And I think there's certain things that have happened societally in these last 15, 20 years that have no doubt contributed to this. The extent to which they have contributed and how much one thing has contributed versus another, I have no idea. But, we started in the late 1990s to, suggest that half of our 18-year-olds should go to university, because the promise is if you get a degree, you earn more money, you get a better job, these kind of things. Well, there are people now that are saying, well, I'm sitting here unemployed, I've got a degree. There's someone that left school at 16 that's actually now got 6 or 7 years of work experience, is earning more than I, and I don't even actually have a job. So that there's a lie. That's a promise that wasn't met. The financial crisis of 2008 had a devastating effect as well. You've got graduates that have got loans in the tens of thousands of pounds. It costs now perhaps 500 times the amount to buy a house than it does a car, when usually it was 10 to 1 was the ratio. So there's all these things that have we've had 15 years of stagnation in the West. We've had politicians and leaders that lie to us, and we don't know the truth. We've had COVID, we've had lockdowns. There's a whole host of really destructive, huge societal, geopolitical events that have no doubt contributed. The extent to which they have that have created this, I don't know. But it's a kind of long way round of answering your question, Michael, which is actually saying my hunch is, and it is a hunch, that it's a growing group. It's grown since we started measuring it. The extent to which it existed before we measured, I don't know. And maybe someone else was measuring it that I don't know about, and in which case, call us and let us know.
Yeah, always looking for that. I think the challenge for brand marketers is to appreciate that we exist beyond our brand, beyond even our category, and that we are delivering messages to humans who have other things on their minds and have other predispositions than just, do I want to buy your mouthwash or do I want to buy your candy bar? And the opportunity to, one of the takeaways that I'm having from our conversation, Steve, is that we have to be more students, more academically aware of the world around us and the people that we're talking to, if we want our work to be effective. If we want for the things that we put into market, whether we're the brand owners of a Fortune 500 brand or we're a single store on the corner of a neighborhood, how to be effective in our work goes beyond just the products that we're selling and the advertising we're doing. It goes to the people that we're reaching out to and their mind states and where we're meeting them where they are. So I think that this is all very helpful to help expand our minds and think more broadly about how we can be effective with our influence and our persuasion.
I like that a lot. Summarized, it's know your place.
Yeah. Pithy and smart, Steve. Thank you. Yeah, that's exactly it. So, Steve, as we come to a close, two things. Number one, could you just talk to us for a minute about influence at work? This is the show that you and Cialdini has started together, and a place that you're spending a lot of your energy and focus. Can you just let everybody know what Influence at Work is focused on right now? And if people want to know more, we'll put the website in the show notes. People can go and click. But can you just give us a little bit of a summary of where your focus is at Influence?
Sure. It hasn't changed, actually. So 25 years we've been operating. We're a team of behavioral scientists led by Bob Cialdini and myself. I've got ridiculously smart, clever people. But what's really interesting about our people is that they're not just smart, they are applied. We have an impatience for a theory that has no meaningful applicability in the real world. We also, perhaps controversially, don't describe ourselves as behavioral scientists. We describe ourselves as applied influence researchers. And what I mean by that is, if you think about, and Richard, I'm sure, I'm rather hoping you'll agree with this, is that when you look at the vast majority of successful applied behavioral science strategies it's basically influence, because influence is everywhere. If you think about it, by every measure survey, whether you LinkedIn, Forbes, Harvard Business Review, and they say, what's the most important skill you need in your business? Influence is always in the top 3. Last year it was number 1. This year it looks like it's going to be number 1 again. So if you have a situation or a challenge where you need to influence an outcome, whether it's a single person, or in the case of some of the work we do in the environment in whole countries and societies, it might be millions of people. How do you do that? How do you do that effectively? How do you do that ethically? And most importantly, how do you do it sustainably? So that's a big focus of our work. Another part of the work that we actually do is, and this is a difficult question to answer because, we're asked, well, you've written all the books on influence. What's the antidote to influence? What if I don't want to be influenced? What is the defense mechanism for that? And, in certain instances, if you think about online scams, financial fraud, these kind of things where, unethical agents are actually using these insights against us to kind of defraud us, steal our money, these kind of things. That's a big focus of work for us. And primarily at the moment, I'm kind of obsessed with this kind of truth and super distrust the stuff. The other thing that I'm really focused on is how, and our organization is not how we can have impact in the moment, but how do we make change last? So it's the persistence of influence and persuasion, not just the momentary impact. And lots of opportunities to do that at the moment, particularly in things like sustainability environments where, our work is actually touching millions of people in that instance. So that's what we do. And it's cool. And I don't think I'm going to be retiring anytime soon. It's too fascinating, too enjoyable.
Well, Steve, we can't thank you enough for spending time with us today. I think there was so many topics we could make a whole other episode on, just to go deeper on some of the things we touched. But it gave our listeners a broad sense of your work and where they can go to learn more. Richard and I, as we always do, will drop down a lot of the topics today into the show notes so people can go deeper. We thank you for spending time with us. For our listeners, if you found today's conversation interesting and insightful, please give a like and follow, and of course, share this episode with others who are passionate about influence, persuasion, behavioral science. Until next time, I'm Michael Aaron Slicker.
And I'm Richard Shotton.
Thanks for listening.
Behavioral Science for Brands is brought to you by Method One. Recognized as one of the fastest growing companies in America for the 3rd year in a row, featured on Inc.'s 5,000 list. Method One is a proudly independent creative and media agency grounded in behavioral science. They exist to make brands irresistible, helping people discover products, services, and experiences that bring moments of joy to their lives. As behavior change experts, Method One creates emotional connections that drive true brand value for their clients, focusing primarily with indulgence brands in the CPG space. Find out more at methodone.com.